While there are many things the DM can do to make combat more interesting, there are also a lot of things you can do. That's what we're going to be talking about in this new series, Actions in Combat. Now, the action we're going to be talking about today is the ready action. Now, how the ready action works, also known as holding an action, is where you sacrifice your action and use that action during your reaction. This reaction is then triggered by a trigger of your choice. It could be when an enemy moves into a position within melee range, or they move up to where your trap is, and you then trigger the trap. There are many creative ways to use the hold action. You can even cast a spell. Unfortunately, though, if the trigger never goes off, your spell is then wasted. Another interesting thing is you can either choose to have it happen when the trigger occurs or ignore the trigger and hope for a better, more advantageous trigger. This is interesting because it's not just a instant shot and release thing, which means that even if you make a mistake, you can choose to just wipe out your action completely. For example, say you're preparing to attack an enemy when they get closer, but that enemy gets polymorphed by an ally. If they move closer, the enemy is in range, so they meet the trigger. But if you attacked, you would have gotten rid of that polymorph, and everything would have gone back to normal. You could instead ignore that trigger and just waste your action because it would be more advantageous that way. Now, there are many pros and cons to the ready action. I'll go over the cons first. For one, you could end up wasting your action. This is because the trigger might not be met, or the trigger might lead to a scenario where you're more injuring your chances than increasing them, which is a problem. Additionally, extra attack doesn't work because extra attack only works with attacks on your turn. This means that, well, because it's now your reaction, it's not your turn. Additionally, it's your reaction, which means you're giving up part of your economy. Now, a lot of these things aren't too big at early levels. You don't have extra attack. The spells that you waste aren't that significant in the first place, and your reaction economy isn't really worth anything yet. But at higher levels, this definitely can become an issue. Now, what's interesting to note is that it's just your action that you're readying, which means that on your turn, you can take a bonus action and then ready an action. Now, this may not have as many advantages as you can't ready your bonus action, which means if you're a monk, you're not going to get off that flurry of blows, but you could patient defense while waiting for your held action to occur. Though for the disadvantages, I stated how it could potentially cause you to waste an action, it could potentially cause you to not waste an action as well. What I mean by that is, say you're fighting like a phase spider and they phase into the ethereal plane. You can't do anything to hurt them, so your action would merely be wasted unless you held your action until the trigger would be that they came back, and then you can attack them. This, of course, is more advantageous to spellcasters and ranged fighters, as if you're a melee attacker, movement could only be part of your ready action. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But because movement, of course, is separate than the ready action, thus you spent that to dash to get closer to their position for next turn. It also allows for more creative actions, waiting for an enemy to move into a more advantageous space to maybe push a boulder down onto them. Could be potentially part of a readied action. And things like traps, which allows for more elaborate setups and uses of actions that are normally not performed because the placement of the enemies may not be advantageous, or because you're limited to what you can do during your turn, and not after other people have done things to set up. Which leads me into my next part, which is it also allows for more collaboration. Now, this is a double-sided coin because, again, triggers could occur and you could choose to not waste that, whether it's advantageous or not. That could go against what your party might be trying to do, like polymorph or something, which means communication is key in this situation. But if the party does cooperate, or encouraging the hold action will encourage cooperation, then, well, you might have something more interesting and elaborate on your hands. For example, say the spellcaster wants to cast Hold Person, but they would do so based off of where their initiative is right before the enemy went, where they could attempt to remake their save and not be held anymore. Of course, there is always the chance that the initial hold person could fail, but this could be a chance worth taking, because instead of having your normal attacks, if the fighters hold their action until after the wizard has cast Hold Person, and they know, because they're in melee range, they know that after the wizard is going to go, the enemy will go, which means that the enemy won't have a chance to move still. This will allow them to get the benefits of the enemy being paralyzed when it wouldn't have otherwise, or they would have had to risk that second save. And of course, in the paralyzed condition, not only do they have advantage on attacks against it, but any melee attack within 5 feet is a critical. Which, this, again, going back to the cooperation things, there's a lot of things you can do to set up as a team, especially with spellcasting effects that might not necessarily be as advantageous because of the enemy being able to save against it, now is because of how you reworked when the enemy's turn will be, and how much of a window you will have to make that spell effective. Now, DMs, I would encourage you to, encourage the players to use the hold action. There are potential ways to do this. One is something I feel like already should be part of the hold action, is give it less disadvantages. Let them have movement as part of their held action in addition to whatever they're going to do besides movement. Or maybe even allow them to have their bonus action within their action, so they could get off, say, that flurry of blows or that second light weapon attack, or even potentially add extra attack to it. You might want to, of course, experiment around with this to see what's fair, but giving more benefits to the hold action, the ready action, will allow the players to use it more, and by therefore cooperate more, and therefore leading to smarter combat, which will both be beneficial to the DM and the players, because new combat interactions will ensue, and therefore a more interesting and strategic combat as a whole. Now, be warned, there is some issues with overusing the hold action, as it can be less effective if you're a player using it, and it's not anything special or homebrew, it's just the normal hold action. Then just defaulting to the hold action can definitely be at a disadvantage, and make those moments when the hold action is used less special as a whole. So I'd be careful about overusing the hold action, but I definitely think it's an underused action that, when used, will allow you to get a little bit of edge in combat. That being said, know your DM. If your DM is one to think as the enemy rather than as the DM, that's probably a better approach to the hold action. Because, for example, if you're waiting for the enemy to walk past where the trap would be triggered that you're preparing to hold to activate, the DM could know you're doing that, and of course make it so that you waste your action and they never go near that space. Also, a DM who is very territorial and aggressive in combat could also call you out on your wording, which is always a dangerous thing when you're readying an action. The trigger, how you word it, could definitely be used against you. So I'd be very careful about that based off of what DM you had. But I bet you as players know your own DM better than I would. So I think the ready action is a underused action that has a lot of untapped potential. Thank you. This is Actions in Combat. I hope you enjoyed this insight into the lesser used actions. And let me know if I messed up on any rules, or if you have any cool examples of the ready action that might encourage others to make use of it.